By the end of the week, Officer Danny Reyes would lose his badge, his pension, and everything he thought a uniform entitled him to. But standing at the corner of 9th Enlargement, with his hand out and his voice rising, he didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that the woman behind the hot dog cart wasn't reaching for her cash box. "I'm not doing this again, Maya," he said, loud enough for the lunch line to hear. 50 a week, same as everybody else on this block. Maya Washington didn't stop working. She turned the hot dog on the flat top, wiped her hand on the towel tucked into her apron, and looked at him the way she looked at anyone who came to her window. Steady, unhurried, like his impatience was weather she'd already dressed for. "I have a permit, Officer Reyes. Signed, current, laminated. I don't pay anyone twice." A woman 2 spots back in line lowered her phone slightly, not to stop recording, just to reposition it. Behind Reyes, 2 more officers leaned against the parked cruiser, arms crossed, grinning like they already knew how this ended. "She's something else," one of them said, not quietly. Reyes stepped closer to the cart, close enough that the umbrella's shadow cut across his face. He pulled a fold of bills from his jacket and set them on the counter, not as payment, as a prop, something to point at. "This is what everybody else pays. The bakery pays it. The pretzel guy on 6th pays it. You want to be the only cart that has problems with health inspection this month. There's nothing wrong with my cart. There will be." The line had gone quiet. A man near the back, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on his head, a folder of paperwork under one arm like he'd been on his way somewhere before he stopped to watch this, shifted his weight but didn't say anything. "Not yet." Maya set down her tongs. She didn't cross her arms to posture. She crossed them because 30 seconds ago, her eyes had started doing something they hadn't done in 9 years, noticing which officer watched the crowd, which watched her, and which one kept his hand closest to his belt. She made them stop. "This wasn't that. This was a corner, a cart, a Tuesday." "You picked the wrong week to test me," Reyes said, and smiled like he'd landed a line he'd used before. 48 hours. Pay, or this cart doesn't reopen Friday." "On what grounds?" "I'll find grounds." That should have been the end of it. A threat, a walk away. The kind of ugly exchange that happens on corners like this one every day and gets swallowed whole. Instead, one of the officers by the cruiser pushed off the car, walked up, and raised his phone toward the permit sticker taped inside the cart's service window. Not to read it, to photograph it. "For the file," he said, and laughed like it was a joke only the 3 of them were in on. Maya watched him do it and said nothing, but something in her face changed for exactly 1 second, not fear, something closer to recognition, like she'd seen this exact move made by different men in a different uniform a long time ago. Right before they started building a case out of nothing, the man with the folder finally spoke. "You don't need a photo of a valid permit," he said, quiet, mostly to himself, but loud enough to reach the front of the line. Reyes turned. "You want to be part of this?" The man didn't answer. He put his eyes back down. That was answer enough, and everyone in line understood it the same way. Whatever this was, nobody standing here was going to be the one who stepped in front of it. Reyes picked the folded bills back up off the counter, tucked them into his jacket like the conversation had already gone his way, and looked at Maya one more time, not with anger now, with something worse. Amusement. 48 hours, he said again. "Think about it." He turned and walked back toward the cruiser, his 2 officers falling in behind him, still laughing about something Maya couldn't hear and didn't need to. The lunch line stayed frozen a moment longer than it should have, the way crowds do after watching something that each described differently later. Maya picked her tongs back up. Her hands were steady. They had been steady the entire time, which was, if anyone had been paying close enough attention, the strangest part of what had just happened. The woman with the phone lowered it fully now, staring at Maya with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite awe, something in between, something that comes from watching someone absorb a threat without flinching and not understanding why. "You're not going to pay him, are you?" she said. Maya slid a hot dog across the counter, wrapped, exact change already counted before the woman had reached for her wallet. "No," she said, "I'm not." She didn't explain why. She went back to the grill, and the line moved forward, and the corner went back to sounding like a Tuesday, but underneath the counter, out of sight, her hand rested for 1 second too long on the edge of the cash box, on the small brass latch that hadn't been opened in 3 years, on what was folded just beneath the register drawer, wrapped in cloth, waiting. 48 hours, he'd said. He had no idea what he'd just started the clock on. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, hit subscribe, because Maya Washington is about to remind an entire police department why they should have checked who they were dealing with. Drop a comment. What do you think is hidden inside that cash box? Because what's inside could change everything. The 48 hours started the way most countdowns do, quietly, with nobody watching the clock but her. Maya closed the cart 20 minutes early and walked it 2 blocks down to Delgado's bakery, where the ovens were still running and the smell of bread hadn't yet given way to the smell of bleach and closing time. Rosa Delgado was wiping down the front case when she saw Maya's face through the glass and stopped wiping. "You saw him today," Rosa said. "Not a question. 48 hours. Rosa set the rag down slowly, the way people do when they've been waiting years for someone else to say the thing out loud first. "We've been paying since March of last year. Started at 20. It's 40 now." She glanced toward the back, toward an office door that had a padlock installed on it that hadn't been there a season ago. "You ask why we never said anything. It's because the last person who said something isn't here to ask." "Who?" "Mr. Delacroix. Ran the churro cart on 6th for 11 years. Rosa's jaw tightened. Refused to pay in the spring. They cited him for an expired thermometer certification he'd renewed 3 weeks earlier. By the time the appeal cleared, he'd missed 2 months of rent on the storage unit where he kept the cart. City auctioned it before he could get the paperwork sorted." Maya didn't say anything for a moment. She'd expected a story like this. She hadn't expected to already know its shape, the invented violation, the paperwork delay engineered to outlast a person's patience, the quiet auction nobody protested because nobody believed protest changed anything. It was smaller than what she used to investigate, and it was exactly the same. "You should pay him, Maya," Rosa said, not unkindly. "I know how that sounds coming from me, but you don't have savings like some of these other shops. You lose that cart, you lose everything. I'm not going to pay him. Then what are you going to do?" Maya didn't answer that either, because she didn't fully know yet, only that something in her had already started moving, the way it used to move before she let herself think a decision through consciously, muscle ahead of mind. She spent the next hour doing something she hadn't done in 9 years, taking a statement. Not on paper, she didn't dare write any of it down where someone could find it, but she carried Delacroix's story with her the rest of the walk home, turning it over the way she used to turn over case files. She'd gone to internal affairs before the auction, she learned from Rosa. He'd gotten a form letter back, thanking him for his concern. No case number, no follow-up. That detail stopped her cold. A form letter. She knew exactly what that looked like, from the other side of a similar system, years and a different uniform ago. The particular bureaucratic silence of a complaint being buried by someone who already knew how to bury one. That night, alone in the back of the shuttered cart lot where she stored her equipment, Maya knelt beside a battered filing cabinet and lifted out a small metal box she hadn't opened in 3 years. Her hands paused on the lid, the way hands pause before a door that's been shut a long time. Not from fear, exactly, but from the strange vertigo of not being certain the person on the other side of it still exists. Inside, beneath a folded cloth, was a laminated identification card, its edges soft from handling, a photo of a younger version of her face, beneath a seal she hadn't looked at directly in years. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. She already knew every line printed on it, the same way she still knew, without effort, how a case number that hadn't technically expired might still open a door most people didn't know existed. She closed the box. Not because she decided against it, because she hadn't decided anything yet, and some decisions needed a full night before they were made. She never got the night. At 6 the next morning, a full day before the 48 hours were up, she heard the cruiser before she saw it, rolling to a stop outside the storage lot gate with its lights off, which was somehow worse than lights on. Reyes stepped out first, already holding a clipboard he hadn't been carrying yesterday, and behind him, a second officer was unspooling yellow tape from a roll. "Health and safety violation," Reyes said. before she'd even reached the gate. Effective immediately. You said 48 hours. I changed my mind. He clipped a padlock through the latch of her storage unit himself, personally, like it mattered to him that she watched him do it. And behind him, the tape went up in a slow yellow line across the door of the only thing she owned outright in this town. Maya stood very still, the way she had the day before, except this time her mind was no longer asking whether she'd open the box. It was asking how fast she could. She hadn't left the box in the storage unit. That was the only reason it wasn't sitting behind yellow tape right now. Some instinct the night before had made her carry it home instead of putting it back in the filing cabinet. The same instinct that used to tell her, years ago, never to leave anything important somewhere it could be taken from her without warning. Now it sat on her kitchen table, lid open, the folded cloth pushed to one side. Maya lifted out the identification card first, the way you'd lift out the least difficult thing in a box you weren't ready to fully empty. Then the dress uniform, pressed and vacuum-sealed in plastic, that had gone slightly cloudy with age. Then, beneath that, a folder, government brown, corners softened from handling, a case number stamped across the tab in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. She hadn't opened that folder in 3 years. She didn't open it now either. Not yet. She just set her hand flat on top of it, the way you'd rest a hand on someone's shoulder before telling them something they wouldn't want to hear. She had spent 9 years as an investigator with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, working corruption cases that never once appeared in a headline, because the entire point of the work was that they never did. She had built cases against officers who'd used rank and uniform to extract money, favors, and silence from people who had no way to say no. She had learned exactly how those men thought, not as villains in their own minds, but as men who believed the rules existed for everyone except themselves, who mistook the absence of consequences for proof they'd never come. Her final case had been the one that ended it. A colonel well-connected who'd been running exactly this, extortion dressed as procedure, threats dressed as policy, against enlisted families who couldn't afford to fight back. She had built the case airtight, 6 months of statements, financial records, corroborating witnesses, and a general 2 levels above her pay grade had made it disappear in an afternoon, quietly, the way these things always disappeared, with a memo that used the word insufficient to describe evidence that wasn't insufficient at all. She'd resigned 4 months later, not because she'd lost, because she'd realized the system she'd sworn to protect would protect itself first, every time, and she no longer wanted to spend her life proving that to herself, over and over. She had opened the hot dog cart 11 months after that. Nobody in this town knew any of it. Not Rosa, not the regulars who tipped her in quarters, not the man with the folder who'd flinched but hadn't spoken. She had built a life here specifically because it asked nothing of her except showing up, and showing up was something she still knew how to do. Reyes didn't know any of it either. That was the part that kept circling back through her while she sat at the table. Not fear, something closer to disbelief at the shape of the coincidence. A man running the exact scheme she'd spent 9 years dismantling in the one town where she'd finally stopped looking for it. She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies she'd made without authorization the week before her resignation, the kind of quiet insurance an investigator keeps when she no longer trusts the institution to keep its own records honest. Statement summaries. A financial pattern analysis. A template she'd built for tracing marked currency through informal collection networks. None of it was usable as is. All of it was a blueprint for exactly what she'd need now. She sat with that for a long moment, because using it meant admitting she was going to do this, not report it and walk away, the way a person with a normal life would, but build it the way she used to build things, patient and airtight and untouchable by the time anyone with authority to bury it ever heard about it. The storage unit lock was still fresh in her mind, the yellow tape, Reyes's clipboard he hadn't needed yesterday. He'd moved the timeline because he could, because nothing had ever taught him there was a cost to moving it. She was going to teach him. At 11 that night, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years, one she'd never deleted, and never explained to herself why. It rang twice. CID, Fort Liberty Liaison Office. This is Colonel Ashworth. Maya closed her eyes for a second before she spoke, because hearing that voice again made the last 9 years compress into something the size of a held breath. Danielle, it's Maya Washington. A pause on the line, not confusion, recognition, arriving all at once. Maya. God. Nobody's called me that name in. A rustle, a door closing somewhere on the other end. Wait. Is something wrong? I need to know if a case number from an old file is still traceable on your end. Unofficially. Before I decide whether to make this official. That depends on the case number. Maya read it off the folder tab, slow, the way you read off something you've kept memorized without meaning to. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds, long enough that Maya knew, before Danielle said anything at all, that the number meant something it shouldn't still mean after all this time. That case was never closed, Maya, Danielle said quietly. It's still open. It's been open the whole time. Nobody ever told you? Maya sat very still, the phone against her ear, the folder open in front of her, the cloudy plastic around the dress uniform catching the kitchen light. No, she said. Nobody told me anything. Then you need to hear the rest of this sitting down, Danielle said, her voice serious. Because the man who buried your case, he didn't just bury it. He's been protecting people exactly like the one you're about to describe to me. For years, and I think you just found where he's been doing it. The FBI agent who finally called her back 3 days later introduced himself as Marcus Webb, Public Corruption Division, and the first thing he said after her name was, Colonel Ashworth says you built half our case for us already. She's not wrong. I didn't realize CID handed this to you. CID doesn't have jurisdiction over a civilian police department, Ms. Washington. Reyes was never in the army. The colonel recognized what your files described the moment she read the case number, and she knew exactly who to call. Webb's tone was matter of fact, the tone of a man who'd made this same clarification before. Public corruption, financial crimes crossing county lines, potential collusion at the department level, that's federal, and that's ours. Maya sat in a booth at the back of a diner 2 towns over. The photocopies from her old folder spread face down on the table, so no one walking past could read them. It's not usable, she told him. I made those copies without authorization. Anything built on them collapses in a courtroom. I know, that's why we're not building on them. Webb slid his own folder across the table, thinner, cleaner. We're using them as a map. Everything we actually charge Reyes with has to come from new evidence, gathered clean from today forward. Your files just tell us where to look. That distinction mattered to her more than he probably understood. She'd spent 9 years watching cases die because someone cut a corner that felt harmless at the time. She wasn't going to let this one die the same way. Webb's team had spent those 3 days pulling threads, not closing them. Enough corroborating leads to believe Rosa and the others were describing something real. 6 businesses paying on what looked like a rotating schedule, funneled through accounts that traced, loosely so far, back to Reyes, his brother-in-law. Nothing was confirmed yet. What they didn't have, and needed most, was Reyes himself, on record, admitting the scheme extended beyond one nervous woman with a hot dog cart. Every case they built against men like him in the past had died on that exact gap. Officers testified it was a misunderstanding, a supervisor's error, a single overzealous stop. Without his own words connecting the dots, 6 separate victims became 6 separate incidents instead of one conspiracy. You want me to get him to say it? Maya said. We want you to let him think he's already won. Webb tapped the folder. Men like Reyes don't confess under pressure. They confess when they're relaxed. When they think the fight's over and they've got nothing left to prove. She thought about the man with the folder from that first afternoon at the cart. The one who'd looked at the ground and said nothing. The one whose silence had told her more than words would have. She thought about Rosa's padlocked office door and Delacroix's cart sitting in some city impound lot with nobody's name on it anymore. When, she said, tomorrow, he'll expect the money at the storage lot, same place he locked you out of. We mic you, mark the bills, and let him talk. That night she didn't sleep so much as rehearse. Not lines, because Webb had been clear that lines sounded rehearsed, and rehearsed things got noticed. Just posture. Stillness. The particular kind of calm that used to keep men twice her rank from reading anything on her face they weren't supposed to read. The next afternoon, Reyes arrived at the storage lot alone, which told her he was confident enough now not to need an audience. He'd traded the clipboard for a relaxed slouch against his cruiser, arms crossed, watching her walk up with an envelope like he already knew exactly how the rest of the conversation would go. "Smart," he said. "Took you long enough." "How do I know this ends it?" Her voice came out steady, the recorder sewn into the seam of her jacket collar, carrying every syllable to a van parked 4 blocks away, where Webb sat with headphones pressed tight and a legal pad already half full. Reyes laughed, short and easy, the laugh of a man who'd never once had to defend himself to anyone who mattered. "It doesn't end anything. It just means you're one of the smart ones now. Like Rosa, like the laundromat." He took the envelope, thumbed through the bills without counting them properly, a man who trusted his own math too much to check it, and tucked it inside his jacket. "You know what your problem was? You thought this was about you. It was never about you. This block's been paying since before you had that cart. You were just the last one who hadn't figured that out." "How many others? Enough that I don't have to work overtime anymore." He said it almost warmly, like he was letting her in on something. "Delacroix figured it out too late. Cost him everything. You're smarter than him." Maya held very still, the way she had the very first day, except now the stillness had a purpose. And if someone reported it, all of it. Reyes's smile didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Reported it to who? "Internal affairs is run by a man who owes his pension to people I answer to. Nobody's investigating anybody. Nobody ever has." He pushed off the cruiser, satisfied, already walking. 40 a week. Every Thursday. Don't make me come find you again. He was 3 steps toward his car when the first unmarked sedan turned onto the block, moving slow, deliberate, no lights. Then a second, from the opposite direction. Reyes didn't notice at first. He was still counting the win in his head, still feeling the weight of an envelope he believed had just bought him another quiet month. It was the third vehicle, the one that pulled directly across the mouth of the lot and blocked his exit, that finally made him stop walking. He turned back toward Maya, confusion arriving on his face a full second before recognition did. And in that second, she watched something in him try to reconstruct. Too late. Every word he'd just said out loud to a woman he'd never once considered worth being careful around. "Officer Reyes." Webb's voice, calm, close now, closing the distance from the van in long, unhurried strides. "We need to talk about your Thursdays." Reyes didn't go quietly, but he did go, cuffed on the pavement outside the storage lot, while Webb's team read him rights he'd spent years assuming applied to everyone but him. He kept saying the same thing, over and over, to anyone standing near enough to hear it. That there'd been a misunderstanding, that the money was for something else, that someone would vouch for him. Nobody did. Within the hour, agents were at the precinct, with warrants, and the 2 officers who'd stood behind Reyes at the cart that first afternoon were separated into different rooms before either could agree on a story. One of them started talking almost immediately. Loyalty, it turned out, had never been the thing holding the scheme together. Convenience had. And convenience evaporates the moment it stops being safe. Maya learned most of this secondhand, in fragments, because for the first 2 days after the arrest, she didn't want to hear it. She'd expected relief. What she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had a shape. It was Danielle who called, not Webb, 3 nights later. "I did some digging after you called me," Danielle said, "about the man who buried your case, your colonel. I wanted to know where he ended up after he made your 6 months of work disappear." Maya sat down slowly on the edge of her kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd opened the box. "He retired with full honors 2 years ago," Danielle continued. "Sits on a consulting board now. Advises municipal governments on, and I want you to sit with this, vendor licensing compliance and law enforcement oversight structures." A pause, long enough that Maya could hear her own pulse in it. "One of the counties on his client list is the one you've been living in for the past year." Maya didn't say anything for a long moment. She thought about the form letter Delacroix had received. The word insufficient, a general had once used to describe evidence that wasn't insufficient at all. The particular, practiced silence of a complaint, disappearing into a system built by someone who already knew exactly how to make complaints disappear. He didn't build Reyes' scheme, Danielle said. I want to be clear about that. We don't have anything connecting him directly. Not yet. But he built the review process that let a police department in a small county go a year and a half without a single internal affairs complaint ever reaching an outside reviewer. He designed the exact kind of silence Reyes was standing inside of. So it wasn't coincidence, Maya said quietly. Her voice was low, almost afraid of the answer. I didn't stumble into something that just happened to look like my old case. No, Danielle said. Firmly, you stumbled into the same system. Different uniform, same architecture. Maya sat with that long after the call ended, the phone dark in her hand, the kitchen quiet around her. It didn't change what had already happened to Reyes. That case was finished. Evidence collected clean. Conviction inevitable regardless of who'd built the walls he'd hidden behind. But it changed something in her. The way learning a wound has a source can change how a person carries it. She wasn't someone who'd wandered into corruption twice by bad luck. She was someone who noticed the shape of a particular kind of rot wherever it grew, because she'd spent 9 years learning that shape by hand, and no amount of walking away from a uniform had ever actually made her stop seeing it. She gave Webb what Danielle had told her. Quietly, off the record at first, because she understood better than almost anyone how easily an accusation aimed at someone with that many connections could collapse under its own weight if it moved too fast. Webb didn't promise anything except that it wouldn't be ignored. I believe you, he told her, calmly, but with weight behind the words. That's different from being able to prove it tomorrow. I know the difference, Maya said. Quietly, with a trace of old bitterness, I used to live inside it. She let it go at that, not because she'd stopped caring what happened to a retired colonel sitting comfortably on a consulting board 2 states away, but because she'd learned, a long time ago, which fights were hers to finish alone and which ones needed to be handed to people with the authority to finish them properly. Webb had that authority now. She didn't need to carry it anymore. What she needed, she realized somewhere in the quiet of that week, was simpler than justice. She needed to know whether the version of herself who'd walked away from the army 4 years ago, tired, disillusioned, certain that standing up for anything only got you buried by someone with a higher rank, was still the only version of herself available to her. Reyes' arrest had answered a legal question. It hadn't answered that one. It answered itself the following Tuesday, when she opened the cart at 6 the way she always had, and Rosa crossed the street with 2 coffees, before Maya had even lit the flat top. You didn't have to do any of it, you know, Rosa said, handing one over, gently. You could have just paid him. Nobody would have blamed you. I know. Why didn't you? Maya thought about the answer for longer than the question probably deserved. Because I already spent 4 years being the version of myself who walks away, she said finally. Quietly, but with growing conviction. I wanted to know if there was still another version left. Rosa didn't ask what she meant. She didn't need to. She just stood there a moment, coffee cooling in her hand, watching the block wake up around them, Delacroix 2 corners down, unlocking a cart that had come back from impound the week before, with the same dent in its side panel it had always had. The auditor from the folder, still eating lunch on the same bench most days now, no longer looking at the ground when officers walked past. Above the register, where a torn health code notice used to hang, Maya had pinned something small, a worn military coin, tucked into the corner of the order window, where only someone who leaned in close would ever notice it at all. A reporter found her there 2 weeks later, notebook already open, before she'd finished wrapping an order. He asked what everyone in town was already asking each other, in quieter voices, whether it was true, what people were saying, about her service record. Maya wiped her hands on the towel tucked in her apron, the same unhurried motion she'd made the very first day Reyes walked up to her window. I ran a cart before all this, she said, calmly. I'll be running one after it. That's not really an answer. It's the only one that matters. She slid his coffee across the counter, exact change already counted before he'd reached for his wallet. I didn't do any of this to be known. I did it because somebody had to, and I'd spent long enough convincing myself it couldn't be me. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. She turned back to the grill, and the line behind him moved forward the way it always had, and somewhere in that ordinary rhythm, the block sounded, for the first time in longer than anyone wanted to admit. like it wasn't afraid of anything anymore. Nobody who walked up to that window looked at Maya Washington like a victim anymore. They just looked at her like a woman who'd never once needed anyone's permission to stand her ground, and who now finally believed that herself. Maya had spent years believing that walking away from the fight was the only way to protect her peace. But standing up to Reyes taught her that courage isn't about having a badge or power. It's about refusing to stay silent when something is wrong. She realized that one person who stands their ground can give others the courage to do the same. Sometimes, justice begins when one person simply decides they will not be intimidated. If this story moved you, tap like, subscribe for more justice stories, and share it with someone who still believes dignity and truth matter. Have you ever seen someone underestimated before anyone knew the truth about them? This story is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters' events and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.